binding regulations on banks so that they don't get in such fragile over-lending situations. And of course, we have much less aggressive mortgage arrangements in the housing market, so we didn't have all these mortgages where people could buy houses with no down payment, and with mortgages that when the rate of interest goes from 0 to something positive, they clearly do not have the income to pay for it. So we didn't have all that. But since we export a good hunk of our output, and 85% of our exports go to the U.S., if they have a financial failure, then that's really bad for our export sales and therefore the buying of our stuff. So we had a strong interest in whether their financial institutions crashed. Anyway, so that's sort of the... just before I go and give the kind of labor and goods market version of the story, before getting into details of fiscal policy, are there any questions or clarifications so far? Yeah.
Okay, this is sort of a huge question. We'll just ask you in case there's a very simple sort of touch-on explanation. I'm wondering how, if the financial institutions in the U.S. the U.S. recession, I'm wondering, is it only because of exports that the world economy was so fragile to the U.S. economy?
No, I think because there are these situations where if some financial sector institutions start to fail, then other people say, gee, maybe mine will too. And so they want to pull their funds out. And for instance, just to take the example of private banks, when I talked about, we put our deposits in, and then they loan a lot of those funds out to try and make a better rate of return on the loans to firms. And they keep some in reserves. Right? Well, it turns out they keep about $1 for every $100 of deposits that go into the bank, maybe one would stay in the reserves, because they have to have something to deal with day-to-day withdrawals and so on. So they're in a fairly precarious position. Our financial institutions too, and because the reserve to deposit ratio is like 1 to 100. So it's fragile because the assets that they have are long-term, like their mortgages to people who bought homes, or a loan to a firm who's built a factory and who's promised to pay it back over 25 years. So if people withdraw their funds from the bank, and you come in with your passbook and say, I want to clear out my account, and so they can't basically say, oh, I'm sorry, we'll give you 1/100 of your account, and we'll deal with you another year. I mean, they've made a commitment to you that you can withdraw it with 7 days' notice and take the whole thing. And you probably don't even know that you needed this technically with 7-day notice. But so their liabilities are short-term, and their assets are long-term. So if they have any significant withdrawals, they're basically bankrupt, right? Because they have to welch on their promise to let people withdraw their deposits. Because they can't turn around to the firm and say, you've got to pay me back on that 25-year loan now. Because that wasn't the terms of that loan. They only have to pay back in 25 years. And anyway, if they somehow could force the firm to sell it, what's the factory going to be worth on the used factory market when you're selling it in a quick period of time? So even if we didn't have any fundamental reason for our financial institutions to fail, the very fact that similar institutions are failing elsewhere would cause our people to say, I think I'll be safe and just take my funds out. And it doesn't take many people to decide to take their funds out to, in fact, there's another self-realizing thing that will make our banks go bankrupt. Now, we have a lender of last resort in the Bank of Canada, and we have deposit insurance. Deposit insurance is supposed to make you think it's stupid to worry along these lines, because if your bank fails, the government will pay you your entire bank account, even if that company isn't there anymore, that private account. So we didn't have the lender of last resort. We didn't have a central bank till 1935. We didn't have deposit insurance till the mid-30s. So we learned all those lessons in the Great Depression. Even though we had no banks, private banks fail in Canada, a third of the banks in the U.S. failed. So that caused us to get these institutions, like a central bank lender of last resort and deposit insurance, so that we're ready for the next one, and hopefully there won't be a crisis of confidence in our institutions. So in principle, if people simply still get scared, they can still be a real problem. But now I take your point that because of those buttressing institutional arrangements, it wouldn't kill us if a bunch of their firms went bankrupt, other than our firms lose all those export sales. That's why I stress that is the thing I first mentioned. Yeah.
It seems to be the consequence of your argument there, that if people could just agree to never make nest eggs, there would never be recession. Is that true?
Well, the problem is there's a kind of a, yes, I guess what you've said is true, but there's a problem in that individually it's not rational for people to listen to that advice, right? Because you say, well, it's sort of like it's irrational to vote. Right? You're too small to matter. So if it costs you anything to vote, why bother? Because, I guess in a small riding.
Yeah, people do vote.
But people do vote because they feel it's, a responsibility. People have fought in wars to give me this right and responsibility, so I don't want to look myself in the mirror and see that I'm, just watching some television show instead of voting. But from a sheer selfish point of view, you're probably not contributing anything to the decision. And similarly, so if you said, I'm going to spend like crazy because it's my duty to keep up aggregate demand in Canada, but if everybody else gets pessimistic and stops spending, there will be a recession, and you'll be sitting there the only guy without a nest egg. So there's that sort of externality problem says that if we could commit to each other to not do this cutback in saving, this bulge in saving, if we could all just agree to not do it, then we wouldn't have the insufficient demand problem. But because we can't coordinate, how can 30 million people credibly commit to one another that I won't stop spending? But that's why we use the institution called government. Because the government is the institution that says, well, I'll behave in a way that's analogous to what would happen if we did manage that very commitment. So it solves the kind of impossibility of getting 30 million people to coordinate on right at that time. You've already elected an institution called the government to do these collective actions for you.
I guess I'm not quite clear on this. So you're saying that the cause of the bank failures in the U.S. is just like their reserves got low and then small market fluctuations rolled them under? Or
I think the basic cause is they have, on the balance sheet, their assets were bigger than the liabilities, so they had a positive net worth. But the assets are things they can't sell quickly.
Right. So
and the liabilities are things they have to honor quickly. So very quickly they can get into a situation where the net worth is negative. So the fundamental problem is financial intermediaries, that's the game they play, is hope that mismatch in terms of terms to maturity on the asset and liabilities side of the balance sheet doesn't come back to haunt them. And you don't want panic setting in because that'll make the customers behave in a way that threatens that presumption.
Sorry, just the point you were making earlier, you're also saying that their long-term assets suddenly became depreciated because people saw them as poor investments in houses that were.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it was particularly exacerbated in this recent round because all these things on the asset side of the bank balance sheet are these claims, these mortgages, which are clearly not ever going to get paid back. So they're just a whole bunch of bad investors, and then they'll have to write them off at some point. So people want to get out of owning those banks and so on. Okay, well let me just go through the labor market, goods market thing. Suppose a recession starts up, a small one, so some people get laid off, so the unemployment rate goes up a bit, and so you've got a bunch of people who'd like to have jobs but don't have them. Well, according to the classical economists, there would be competition then among the would-be workers and the guys who still have jobs. So the would-be workers, I'll tell this in a particularly unrealistic fashion just to kind of make the point. The would-be workers would knock on the factory doors and say, how much you paying that guy? Well, I'll work for less, So wages get pulled down by competitive pressure. And then because there's competition among the firms too, now that their unit costs are lower because they're all managing to pay lower wages, they would be able to still maintain their profit margins and sell at lower product prices, and competition among them would force that to be the case. So the price of goods would get bid down through the wage price going down. And of course, the cheaper is something, normally, the more people will buy of it. So the falling price of goods re-stimulates the demand for goods. And so that's supposed to be the idea. Right? Now, it's easy, when you think of, well, why does a falling price make people buy more of our stuff? Well, it's because we normally think, well, when we're having a recession, the rest of the world isn't. So if our prices are falling, and there's no reason to hypothesize their prices be falling, then our relative price is falling. Okay, So that's why people buy more cars.